Good morning, everyone. Can I welcome you to the 9th meeting in 2013 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind everyone to switch off their mobile devices as they do affect the broadcasting system. We have apologies this morning from Adam Ingram, and I'm sure the committee would want to wish him a speedy recovery. And we have Jill, who will attend as the committee substitute. The first item of business is decisions to be taken in private, and I seek the agreement of the committee to take agenda item 5 in private to allow the committee to consider a letter from the Finance Committee in relation to the budget strategy fees. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
That is agreed, thank you. Agenda item 2 is community transport. The first item is to hear evidence from the Community Transport Association as part of the committee's inquiry into community transport in Scotland. I welcome John McDonald, who's Director for Scotland Community Transport Association. So, John, we've got a few questions that we'd like to ask you. Can I welcome you to the committee and thank you very much for coming. And before I do that, we've just had enter the room Greg Applin, MP, from the Parliament of New South Wales, who's has a very keen interest in community transport and is with us for this part of the meeting at least. I do hope you find this session today informative and interesting, Mr. Applin. Welcome. So, John, can I ask you to provide a brief overview of the community transport sector in Scotland and how you see it today?
Okay, well, first of all, just to explain what our role is at the Community Transport Association, we exist to represent the interests of community organisations, voluntary organisations, social enterprises, the third sector, such organisations who get involved in transport. And we have we're a membership organisation. In Scotland we have 150 members, and across the UK we have 1,500 members. Now, to try and summarise what's happening in community transport across Scotland, just to give you a feel for the size and shape of the sector, we conducted a survey at the CTA 2 years ago where we spoke to about 80 groups, really the 80 largest groups, 80 of the largest groups in Scotland. In addition to our members, there's probably many more small organisations. You know, we did an exercise about 2.5 years ago to look at how many organisations we actually knew were in any way involved in community transport in any capacity, and we came to a figure of about 250. So in terms of numbers of organisations, it's probably of that order. In terms of income to the sector, when we asked people, organisations, what their annual turnover was and combined that to try and assess what the financial value or the financial throughput of the sector was, the figure we came to was about £10 million. So in terms of money going through the sector, it's of that order. What that figure, however, doesn't tell you is it doesn't really give value. It doesn't give the value of the sector. So, for example, in the sector, there's about 400 people employed, both on a full-time and part-time basis. But of the groups we spoke to, there were something like 2,500 volunteers. And I'd say, in addition to the groups we spoke to, there's at least another 1,500 people involved in community transport on a voluntary basis. So maybe 4,000 people in total. When we did our survey with the 80 groups, we asked about numbers of volunteers, but another question we asked was roughly how much time people actually gave to organisations. So some people give a lot of time, some people give maybe an hour or two here and there. And we came to a figure of, I think it was 278,500 hours in a year. And if you were to attach the minimum wage rate to to 1 hour of voluntary time, the figure we came to was something like £1.7 million. So I think that gives you an idea of added value. It will be more than that because there are many more volunteers that we don't necessarily know of. In terms of passenger journeys, a passenger journey is one journey from A to B. So if somebody came back from B to A, that's 2 journeys, and that's the standard practice, that's the standard way of measuring passenger journeys in the transport industry. The total number of passenger journeys provided by the sector in Scotland, we calculated, came to something like £3.5 million. Sorry, 3.5 million passenger journeys. There are community transport's not one thing. There's a lot of different types of models, ranging from organisations that provide dial-a-ride services, which are demand responsive, so people kind of phone in advance to ask to be taken to the places they wish to go, as one model. Group hire of vehicles, in other words, hiring out vehicles to voluntary bodies, community groups, to take them to the places they wish to go, is another model. Car schemes are another model. These are situations where people, volunteers, use their own cars to take people in their neighbourhoods to the places they wish to go, and they'll normally get a mileage payment to cover the cost of fuel and wear and tear to their vehicles, is another model. So some organisations are one of these, and many are a mixture. And in terms of, to give you a feel for size of organisations, the biggest operator in Scotland would have a turnover of about £2 million. That's at one end. But at the other end, you can have an organisation run entirely on a voluntary basis, where everybody's a volunteer, and it runs on a few £1,000s, under £20,000 perhaps, in a year. In our survey, we found that there were something like 19, I think it was, groups in Scotland had a turnover of more than £100,000 a year. £100,000 a year. So most operators are very small, with turnovers below 100,000, well below 100,000. Typically, some organisations, as I said, are run entirely on a voluntary basis. Others employ people. Everyone involved in the organisation, apart from the trustees, may be drivers, coordinators, managers, maybe paid staff. But generally, there's a mixture of both paid staff, a small number of paid staff, and then quite a number of volunteers. There's been the last few years, obviously, with the financial crisis, that's had an impact on community transport, in that public finances have become tighter. The sector does depend upon particularly local authorities, and the funding from public body sources has decreased, and so organisations are having to think quite widely about how they sustain their services.
I think we'll come on to specific funding arrangements and further questioning, but if you were to put all the groups that you know of on a map, is it fairly well spread out through Scotland, or are there glaring gaps? And in those gaps, have you had individuals or groups contact you saying, how do we go about it, and have they found it just too difficult? You know.
Yeah, there are gaps. I mean, we actually produced a map a couple of years ago and dotted all the organisations that we knew, but sometimes the dot can be a tiny organisation in, let's say, one village in the Highlands, and it might look good on a map, but the extent of the service might be tiny within a relatively small geographic area. there are many gaps. There are some areas that are quite well served, but many large gaps. We do get people and organisations coming to us with a view to, with a view to looking at how they might set up services. I mean, I personally have had 3 or 4 in the last couple of weeks. Somebody from Aberdeenshire, in rural Aberdeenshire, who talked about the lack of service in that particular area and how they might go about doing something. There was somebody from the south end of the Kintyre Peninsula who spoke to us about the possibility of setting up a service. In that particular instance, the first question is, well, where does the money come from to enable something to be set up? But they had identified a potential source in that instance, which was a community-owned wind farm in the vicinity, and they saw that the income which the wind farm was producing could be used to develop their own community transport service. So we do get calls from time to time from people in areas where there is no transport whatsoever, no public transport or very little transport, and at least individuals wanting to do something about it.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. Alex.
Thank you, Convener. I'm going to ask you the free-hit question. What are the key challenges facing community transport operators in Scotland in the next few years?
The biggest challenge is funding, there's no doubt about it. But when you strip away, well, what does that mean? For well-established services, when I've asked people who manage services that have been around for many years, what keeps you awake at night? Quite often the answer is replacing my vehicles. So they've got a service that's running well, it's running good day-to-day services, but but vehicles have a limited lifetime, usually about 8 to 10 years. But there is a big problem with replacing those vehicles. Tied in with funding also is the short-term nature. In the last few years, funding that has been given has been very short-term. There are very, very few organisations that have got commitments from funders for more than 1 year hence. And that's something that we picked up from our survey. We asked them how far into the future they felt they could plan their business, and something like 70% said that we can't really see much more than a year into the future. So that's a problem, because transport is something that it's a long-term proposition, and it's difficult if the commitments made to you are for such a short period of time. It can hold back decisions, for example, on replacing vehicles, if you don't have a feel for the future, or even for people who might be looking at leasing, for example, of vehicles. Most leasing companies wouldn't be interested in any arrangements for below three-year commitment, but many operators aren't quite sure of whether they're going to be in existence in a year's time.
A particular problem, because when I've spoken to community transport organisations, they have spoken to me, as you have, about the cost of replacing vehicles. And of course my instinctive suggestion is that local authorities, even private companies, wouldn't buy, they would lease under similar circumstances. And is that the issue of longer term funding the key thing that is preventing community transport organisations taking that route of leasing?
Taking the leasing route. I think it's part of the equation. The sector generally isn't used to leasing, to be honest. It's not in the culture of the sector. Most organisations try to raise the capital at the outset to buy a vehicle. So in most instances, people actually own the vehicles. But when people look at costs in the long term between owning vehicles and leasing costs, leasing costs in the long term are greater than ownership. The advantage of leasing for short-term needs is that you don't necessarily need to have the capital to buy the vehicle quickly. So, for example, if you're going for a particular contract, you might consider leasing if the contract was valued at 3 years, and you just buy in a vehicle to match that particular contract. But contracting, again, isn't a typical feature of the sector. So leasing isn't common, but in the last 2 or 3 years, certainly from my perspective, from talking to people, it's on the agenda for community transport operators. But I still think that most would prefer to own their vehicles and try and look towards a longer time horizon.
Is there anything else you see in the future other than the funding issue, or is the funding issue what dominates everything?
There is an issue to do with drivers of vehicles. Now, basically, anybody who got their driving license, their ordinary driving license, prior to 1997, if they look closely at it, they'll see an entitlement to drive what's called D1 classified vehicles. Most people probably have never noticed that and are unaware that they have that entitlement. But in January 1997, there was an EU directive which changed things, and that in time will have quite a big impact on the sector. Basically, the long and the short of this is that people who don't have D1 on their license are restricted to being able to drive a vehicle of under a certain tonnage, 3.5 tons it is. Most vehicles which community transport users use, minibuses, have a weight that's greater than that.
And is it the case that vehicle weights are actually gradually rising over time?
They are. They are rising because many people looking at this will look to have accessible vehicles. They might anticipate that people using the vehicles may be in wheelchairs. Many wheelchair technology is getting heavier. So things are getting sophisticated, but they're getting heavier. If you're constructing your vehicle, you would look to have a really quite robust vehicle. So generally, vehicles are getting heavier. Now, what that means is that people who don't have D1 on their license are unable to drive vehicles greater than a 3.5 ton tonnage unless they obtain a D1 license. Now,
I think we'll come back to that. Maybe if we could go back to the financing, because I think, Elaine, yours question relates to permits and things. If we come back to the finance, originally the finance for community transport came directly from central government and it was devolved to the local authorities, but it wasn't ring-fenced. And that's why you've seen the cuts from local government. Would you like to see it come back to a situation where it came directly from central government?
Well, up until 2008, central government had two funding pots specifically for community transport. One was called the Rural Community Transport Initiative, and which had a value of about £1 million a year. And the other was, it was titled Urban Demand Responsive Transport Funding for the four main cities in Scotland, Aberdeen, Dundee, Edinburgh and Glasgow. And in 2008, that funding was wrapped up, totaled about £2 million per annum. The funding was wrapped up and passed to local authorities to do with as they wished. Now, while that funding was in place, it had been in place for about 10 years, but the growth in community transport occurred during that period. And I would say that the catalyst towards that growth was that central government funding. Now, generally, organisations bidding into that fund, they would have required the support of the local authority also. And so when the propositions were being put forward, there was usually an element of local authority support, financial support for the proposition also. Now, so things changed in 2008 with national government leaving community transport really to local authorities to deal with and to make their own decisions on funding. But as you say, funding was not ring-fenced. Certainly at that time there was a lot of fear in the sector that things would disintegrate. I wouldn't say they have disintegrated drastically in the past 5 years. Some local authorities have kept to the funding, the kinds of funding commitments that were being made prior to 2008. So they have kept to that. In other areas, it has been cut, and there are other areas where there isn't a great deal of community transport activity. There hadn't been a great deal of community transport activity anyway. But at the moment, it's really, if you're looking at setting up a service, if you're in a local authority area that doesn't really value community transport, then you're straight away going to find it extremely difficult to work out a service locally.
And I think, people who know about community transport do realise the benefit of it, and I think you can see it in terms of health and things, and we'll come specifically to the health boards in a minute. But, how do we persuade those councils who don't see the value of community transport to... Is there a role that, our report or we as a committee can have to stress the value of it?
I think if local authorities had as time's gone by, we're seeing some changes in transport generally. And now, bus is by far the most important form of public transport in Scotland. It's far more people use bus than train, for example. And if you like, community transport, trying to work out where it fits on the transport spectrum, it kind of fits in somewhere between bus services and taxis. So sometimes you can have more or less a personal service like a taxi. However, you don't get the immediacy of a taxi service. Usually you would, for a car scheme, for example, you would have to be planning your journeys a day or 2 or 3 in advance. Mm-hmm. And similarly with bus services, sometimes services look like a bus service, but they're not necessarily scheduled. So they're pretty flexible. So they don't work to fixed timetables. Sometimes they do, but most don't work to fixed timetables. So community transport fits in somewhere there. Now, if we take it that bus is by far the most important form of public transport in Scotland, we're seeing a pattern of decline in bus services across the country. A recent study commissioned by the Confederation of Passenger Transport found that, I think it's since 2008, the mileage provided by the bus industry to Scotland has reduced by 12.5%. So there's been a gradual decrease in services. Now, I would have thought that would be worrying for a local authority. I mean, citizens do need to get to places, and local authorities, despite the fact that they may not have a statutory responsibility to sort that problem out, I mean, to have a properly functioning area, this would be a concern for them. And I would have thought that given the decline of of bus services around the country. And given the demographic profile of this country, where the number of older people is set to rocket over the next few years, I mean, when I hit 80, there'll be twice as many people at that age, at that time, and another half. And so we need to be thinking ahead to working out how older people, for example, are to get out and about. And I think community transport has already proven that it's got a useful role there. So in terms of what the committee might do with local authorities, I think that a useful role would be to try and encourage local authorities to put this higher up on their political agenda, to see that that community transport has something of value that it can offer, and for it not to be seen as really an afterthought, which I think has, often been the case in the past.
Okay, Elaine. Sorry.
Thanks. If we could return to the issues about licensing and so on. You've described the fact that there's a lot of different components to community transport, from dial-a-ride to people using their private cars, and we have operators that hold public service vehicle operators licences, section 19 permits, section 22 permits, and of course the more informal arrangements as well. Are there ways in which the operator licensing regime might be improved and simplified?
Yes. When people come to community transport, the people who come to it, the motivation is to give people in their neighbourhoods access to services. So it's to improve their community. Most people do not come to this as transport experts. And what they immediately find when they start exploring this is that it is extremely complex. It's highly regulated. And as you said, there are various types of permits that allow you to do certain things. But no matter which way you turn, there's always a kind of sting in the tail. So, for example, with a Section 19 permit, which is by far the most common form of permit in community transport, great thing is that you've got a lot of flexibility. The sting in the tail is that you can only carry certain types of passengers only, so you're pretty restricted as to what you can do. Section 22 permits allow you to carry the general public, but you have to really design your service in detail up front. So more or less you have to work out your routes, you have to work out when you're going to be running, and then once you register that with the traffic commissioner, and once you register that, if you want to change it, there's quite a laborious process of changing it. So the bureaucracy is quite significant. And with car schemes, essentially the legislation which applies to car schemes is exemptions from private hire and taxi legislation. So it basically allows you to carry people and charge a fare, but it can't be for a profit. And it can only be used to pay for the wear. You can only charge up to a certain level to pay for wear and tear of vehicles, but you can't build in, for example, if you'd built up a large car scheme, the coordination costs and extra costs of marketing and that sort of thing. So when groups get involved in this business, they immediately face a whole raft of legislation. They've got to be quite careful as to how they design their services. Now, I don't have an immediate solution to your question, but I would have thought that if it was possible to create one permit for the voluntary sector, which gave you flexibility and cut out a fair amount of the bureaucracy, then that would be a boon to our sector. Really, it would make life a lot easier. And I think the basis of it should be that the organisations who are seeking these permits, the key thing is that they are non-profit distributing organisations. So they're not in this for to make money, as per se. They're there to. The driver is to address local needs, and if they make any surpluses, that should be invested into the organisation and not, for example, given as dividends to shareholders. That's the key difference between any charity and a commercial organisation. It's what you do with your money, and if you make any surpluses with a charity, you're not distributing that outside the organisation. You're reinvesting it into the organisation. So if there was a way in which we could have a simplified system with perhaps one permit, that would be good.
For clarification, in terms of the issuing of these permits, are they issued under UK legislation?
They are, yes.
Yeah, so it wouldn't be something that we could do. I've just got you were mentioning the issue about the D1 permits, which if you'd passed your test after January 97, you would no longer be on your licence. If somebody wishes to be able to drive those, do they have to set another test? Is it expensive? Is it?
They do. And it is expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Costs are of the order of £800 to £1,000.
Mm-hmm. It's quite prohibitive then. In
yes, so it's quite significant. Now, what the D1 problem, in a nutshell, the problem with the D1 is that nobody under, I think it's 33 or 34 years old, 33, 34 years of age at this point in time, nobody will have this on their licence, which means that they can't drive as a paid employee or a volunteer. They can't drive a vehicle greater than 3.5 tonnes or 4.25 tonnes if it has a passenger lift. And as Mr. Johnson asked earlier, most vehicles, the tonnage is greater than that. So what we have, for example, if you're looking at volunteers driving vehicles, at the moment, if you're under 33, you can't drive, no matter how community willed you are, without the D1 licence, you can't drive one of these vehicles. Or if you're a teacher, for example, taking children to sports events or to plays or whatever it might be in a minibus, then again, without D1 on your licence, you can't do it. Now, as each year goes past, in a few years' time, nobody under 40 will be able to drive a vehicle without D1. 10 years hence, it'll be an older and older population. I see that as a problem. It's a legislative problem, but the impact is that costs for community transport operators, but also local authorities who, in education departments, their costs are going to rise. It's a cost that's largely prohibitive to a volunteer. Not many volunteers are going to be willing to spend £1,000 to obtain a licence. And in addition to the cost, it's also the time that's the time input into obtaining that licence.
And this is legislation from Europe. It's not
yes,
something over which governments have much control.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Margaret, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, what I was going to ask was, if you had a simpler form of your sort of permits, would it then allow you to actually claim concessionary fare travel as well? Because I know people that are over 60, 65 do have the concessionary bus pass, but they've got to pay in some areas for the community transport bus. Would that allow that?
It depends on how if you're to create a new permit, it depends on how that was designed and also how it fits in with the concessionary fare scheme. Now, at the moment, the key to the concessionary fare scheme is that it is only you can only participate in the scheme if you're running what are called registered services. Now, within our sector, if you operate a Section 22 service, which is for the general public, when you create this, you register that service, and that enables you to participate in the concessionary fare scheme. However, there are only about 20 odd such services in Scotland, and most of these are very small. So Section 22 at this point in time is not a major feature of the community transport sector. Most services are run under the Section 19 permit, and they are not eligible for the concessionary fare scheme because they're not registered routes. That's technically what bars them from participating. But as you say, most users of community transport are over 60 and have the concession, but they can't use it on community transport services, and in most instances have to pay for that service. Now, even if Section 19 services were to be included, within the concessionary fare scheme as it's currently designed, there's another two big problems. One is that you need to have specific hardware and software facilities in order to participate, and the costs of that are of the order of £5,000 to £10,000. So, a very small community transport operator would have to think about that cost first of all. The second big problem is that if you're participating in the concessionary fare scheme, the reimbursement rate to the operator currently is 60%. And next year, 2013-14, it will be reduced to 58.1%. So for the community transport operator, there's this big question of how do we handle the 40% differential? It would be very difficult to offer services for free if the operator is having to find that 40% of the fare. Now, my understanding of the thinking of the concessionary fare scheme is that the reimbursement rate has always been less than 100%. I think it started off at about 73-74%. But it was viewed that the scheme would generate new passengers. So there was a generation factor, and the volume of these new passengers would, you'd gain economies of scale, which made a bus operation perfectly viable. But it kind of assumes that you're a big operator. That generation factor wouldn't necessarily apply to a small community transport operator. Their opportunities for growth would always, I think, be pretty limited. So even if we were considering if we were to stick to Section 19 services, even if we were to consider including these services within the concessionary fares, these are two huge barriers. So, you would have to look at the concessionary fare scheme running in a different manner. It wouldn't be a neat fit, just simply including Section 19 services in the scheme as it's currently designed.
Can I ask another one? Then would you then actually sort of go back to the operators of each of the community transport groups and look at the individuals that are running it and see if they've actually got the skills to think outside the box to see how they can generate different forms of income to supplement the grants that they're getting just now?
Yeah, that would be possible, but that's exactly what you would have to do. You would have to think perhaps out of the box. You would really have to think hard about how you make your service sustainable. How are you going to work out that 40%? But it may be possible that you could obtain funding resources from other sources.
Yeah, I wasn't actually meaning the concessionary fare. I was meaning how do we get other forms of income actually coming in to the organisation as such. I went to visit an organisation yesterday who was running it, and one of the ideas that I thought about they could actually do would be to run the bus service at night time for the young people that live in the village, to take them to a venue at the weekend for their entertainment and bring them back home again, and that would help to keep the young people in that community. But I don't know if that would contravene the rules and regulations of community transport, and also, you know, the sort of not-for-profit charitable status as well.
So long as what you're doing is not for profit or incidental to a profit, you're fine. So, for example, with youth groups, for example, if you were hiring out your vehicles to a youth organisation, which in most instances would obviously not be a for-profit activity, then that income could be used to contribute towards the costs of a service that, if you're looking for that 40% differential. The other thing I should say about concessionary fares is that a lot of community transport operations running under Section 19 services are group hire services. So the vehicle is hired perhaps by a voluntary body and maybe taking 12, 15 people to wherever they're going. And it may be the organisation that's hired in the vehicle that's actually paying for that, not necessarily the people on the vehicle. So in considering community transport and concessionary fares and Section 19 services, it could only ever work where you have a fare-paying passenger. So it has to be an individual on that bus paying a fare. Yeah. And many services, individuals do not actually pay fares. But it would be worth looking at how this would work, how this might work in practice, whether it's possible to tweak legislation to accommodate Section 19 services, because on the social inclusion principles of the scheme, community transport really meets these objectives very well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Gordon, do you want to come in here? On?
Just a very quick point. I mean, you've covered most of the concession aspects that I was going to ask you about, but on a practical terms, the Scottish Government has invested a substantial amount of money on ticketing equipment for public transport operators throughout Scotland, and that's provided a very efficient data collection basis which for reimbursement of concession claims. And bearing in mind that 2/3 of the vehicles that you have in community transport are private cars, have you thought about, if we were to extend concessions to community transport, on a practical basis, how would you collect the data, and what would be the cost of collecting that data?
Well, if this was to be done on the basis of how things are at the moment, it would be very difficult to deal with cars. Plus, the whole scheme changes from being a bus concessionary fare scheme to something different. So that's a significant step. That's a significant change. But there would also be problems with cars, for example, if it's a car scheme with volunteers, they may not be willing to have equipment put into their vehicle. So the only practical way around that, if you were if you're starting from a social inclusion principle and including vehicles that are not buses, could be MPVs or cars, would be through handheld equipment. I understand that there is a handheld piece of equipment which is being looked at the moment by Transport Scotland, and certainly that would be of interest to our sector. Now, I know a little bit about the infrastructure behind reimbursement and ticketing, and when you look at that, the system is geared towards, it kind of assumes a bus operator with a large depot, really, you know, designed in the way that traditional bus operations run with large depots. And with community transport, many community transport operations, they don't have depots. They've maybe got 2 or 3 vehicles which are kept behind a building or in a yard or something. So it is a little bit it is a little bit different for our sector unless the technology changes, and it may well be changing in favour of small operators. In terms of cost, I mean, yes, you're right, the Scottish Government did provide substantial funding at the beginning of the concessionary fare scheme. I think it was in the order of £30-odd million for operators to buy the equipment and participate in the scheme, and that's no longer, that funding is no longer available. But for community transport operators, you know, that is a problem, because certainly when we visited Transport Scotland a couple of years ago to try and establish what the costs were in participating, and unless somebody's providing it for you, then it is of the order of £5,000 to £10,000. However, there are some local authorities and regional transport partnerships who, if a community transport operator, for example, is prepared to run a Section 22 service, which can participate in the concessionary fare scheme, then they largely are covering the back office costs. Highland Council, for example, I think if you're there's a nominal charge for the service, but it's reasonable. Operators are not having to absorb the full cost. And also, I think in the SPT area, which covers, I think it's 11 or 12 local authority areas, if there are community transport operators running Section 22 services there, then again they will provide the back office equipment and do the job for them, and that's helpful. But that's not the case throughout Scotland, throughout the whole country.
Right. On another practical point, the reimbursement formula is based on shadow or standard fares, and you obviously get the new formula is 60% of the shadow or standard fare. So given that a lot of the community transport is either demand responsive or, as you said, group hire or various car schemes, how would you identify what a standard fare was for a particular journey?
At the moment, you can't. You know, there's no such thing as the standard fare in community transport. Within our own organisation, the Community Transport Association, when we're talking to small groups looking to get involved in this, we really impress upon them the need to really bottom out costs so that fares are sustainable. Sometimes, so that the fare is at a level which is, you know, obviously going to be reasonable for users of the service, but also that it covers their own needs. Quite often, groups coming into this are motivated in a different way from a commercial bus operator. They want to address problems that they're seeing in their neighbourhood, and sometimes, you know, the motivation, sometimes in practice they look to try and run a service at as low as possible a cost for the passenger, and sometimes they look to try and provide that for free. And we will usually advise that they should not provide it for free, because unless somebody else is paying for that, it's not, in the long term, it's going to be difficult to sustain that. So it's a difficult question to answer. It depends on the operator and what they're constituted to do and how they go about their business. But community groups really do need to work out their costs pretty accurately if they were to participate. You know, if concessionary fares were to be opened up to the sector in a wider manner.
Okay.
I think it would help. Because it would help to force community groups to think through costs more than perhaps they do at the moment.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Jim.
Good morning, Mr McDonald. I wonder if I could explore the issue of growing demand for community transport services in order to access health and social care services. One of the issues that you highlight in your State of the Sector report is the significant decrease in the number of non-emergency journeys provided by the Scottish Ambulance Service. I think the figure you quote is 1.5 million fewer journeys since 1998. Is that, I think I'm right in saying. So how do you view the growth in demand? Is that, as it would obviously appear to be, driven by the decline in non-emergency journeys provided by the Scottish Ambulance Service, or other factors at play?
Yeah, this is probably a growing area for community transport. You know, we are hearing regularly from operators around the country of situations where they're being called by hospitals to, to see whether they can take people, quite often long distances, home, or taking them to appointments at hospital. So it's growing. I can't give you a feel for numbers, but you've identified what I think are accurate numbers. I picked up a figure towards the end of the 90s. There was something like the Scottish Ambulance Service provided 2.4 million patient journeys in Scotland. At the moment, I saw something very recently which suggests that right now the figure is 1.3, so it's down from the 1.5 that was quoted in our State of the Sector report two years ago, back in 2011, or sorry, just over a year ago. So that's quite a significant shift, and Scottish Ambulance Service are focusing the resources more on providing emergency services and looking to have less involvement with non-emergency patient transport. Now, there is a case for saying that in non-emergency situations, some people could use public transport, and I'm sure they could in some instances. I couldn't give you a feel for figures. I just don't know what the extent of that might be. Others do have their own private transport and could get to and from hospital appointments using their own private transport rather than having an expectation that they should have a transport, and that will certainly be the case also. But there are others, and these are the people we're hearing about more and more, who perhaps don't have private transport, or perhaps are not fit enough to drive their private transport, live in areas where there is no public transport, and for whom getting to and from hospitals in particular is a big problem. Now, the problem with this, I think, is that I'm aware that the NHS is not one body. In Scotland, I think there are something like 20 odd different bodies, but collectively, this problem of non-emergency patient transport is not being tackled effectively.
So what do you think should be done about it? I noticed in your report that you quote Audit Scotland's recommendation that councils and NHS boards should consider community transport services as part of their overall strategy. That appears not to be being done.
Yeah, I think what should be done is that NHS bodies, whether it be Scottish Ambulance Service or NHS boards, if there's a recognition that this is a problem and there is a view that perhaps the community transport sector could do something, rather than just give information on lists of organisations who are involved in community transport, but without information about what these organisations actually do and whether patients would be actually eligible for these services. It would be better for the NHS bodies to explore more, well, what do you do and how does it work? and is there a fit with our need for taking patients to and from hospitals. So, for example, group hire vehicles, that doesn't meet that need, but car schemes do, because car schemes is a much more personalised service, and it's ideal for taking a patient who's not in an emergency situation, yet maybe particularly frail, to an appointment, but and allow them to get home as well. And discharge is actually a bigger problem than getting to hospitals. And in amongst that discussion, there has to be discussion about how it works financially, because we're not really getting very far, because people are not focusing in on the money. Now, it may be reasonable to expect patients to contribute towards a cost, but many patient journeys the costs are prohibitive. You know, I've heard of instances, for example, of people in Rigmore Hospital being discharged and approaching a community transport operator to take them up to Wick by car, and not being willing, no discussion about how that cost should be covered. So we have to get down to how journeys should be paid for. Should the NHS contribute towards that cost to some degree? Should patients be contributing? But until we have these sorts of conversations, this problem of non-emergency patient transport is just going to continue to be difficult.
Thank you. Hopefully our report will be able to push this issue further up the agenda. Thanks very much.
Possibly with the integration of health and social care, there's a window of opportunity there to have these kind of discussions at a local level with community transport organisations, I would have thought. Margaret.
Back to your report again, Mrs McDonald. It highlights that there's concerns about the ability of the community transport operators to actually access and secure public sector contracts. Can you expand on these concerns and give me some ideas how they could be resolved as well?
There's been a tendency to move towards contracting over the last few years, as opposed to grant aiding. Services being run with a grant provided by typically a local authority to enable the community transport operation to run. Now, there is a push towards contracts, but in practice what we're picking up is that operators are finding the bureaucracy attached to contracting and tendering for contracts tortuous, and sometimes, often, over the top when you look at this in relation to the value of the contract. So the contract might be just a few small £1,000s a year, but the bureaucracy attached to it is too much. There's, with Section 19 services, you can't tender for most transport contracts anyway. You can only tender for, if anything could be deemed to be a commercial contract, you're pretty restricted in what you might be able to do. So under the permit that most people have, most operators have, you're pretty restricted in what you could tender for, and it can't be commercial in order for you to obtain the Section 19 permit. So it's a bit, people find the tendering and procurement world extremely difficult to penetrate, and yet there is a move by public bodies in that direction. Now, I think what I said in our report is that we would prefer to see some sort, a continuation of a mixed approach of grant aid, service level agreements, sometimes contracts. But I don't, whilst sometimes in public bodies officers see contracts as a be-all and end-all solution, it wouldn't work particularly well for many community transport operators.
For the operators that do actually apply for contracts through Public Sector Contracts Scotland website, do you think they've actually got the skills and the ability to actually put in competitive tendering? Have they been in training courses? Have they done this before? Do they know what's actually required?
Across the board, probably not in general, but there have been, over the last 2 or 3 years, at the Community Transport Associations, we've pointed anybody who's interested in the direction of training for bidding for contracts, which has been very good. And a few organisations have gone in that direction. So yes, there is a skill attached to tendering for contracts, but really I think you have to go back to the very beginning and ask yourself whether is tendering the best approach towards social-based transport, because a lot of community transport, it evolves. When people start, they don't actually know how their transport service will actually work. It evolves, and the Section 19, the flexibility of permits is good for that. So once you're established, yes, you've worked out your model and it's working well.
Yeah.
But if you're putting a straitjacket at the very beginning by, right, you can apply for a contract, but here it is, quite often that suits the local authority, but it doesn't necessarily suit the needs of the local community. So it's, yes, there is a place for contracts, but I think it should be, it's an element of community transport, but I'm not so sure that if we find in years to come that all services are run on a contract basis or tendered for contracts, that will necessarily be a good thing.
Okay, thank you very much.
Jill?
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Ms Mcdonald. You touched on the issue earlier on in your evidence with regards to continuity and certainty of funding. And I know that the committee has received written evidence that backs up what you're saying. So it is an issue. But I don't think, for the public record, you came up with some suggestions how we could address that, and maybe give you the opportunity to have it in public record, so we can have it part of our report. So if you could say if you've got ideas how we can solve that problem.
Yeah, funding is the biggest issue. But if you were to strip away that, by saying, well, we can't fund everything, if we did have resources, what would be the best use of these resources? I think something that would make a difference specifically is, I touched earlier on the fact that replacing vehicles is a big problem for very well established organisations who've been around for sometimes 20 or 30 years. And if funding could be found to deal with that specific problem, that would make a big difference. So you're not asking for the world, you're not looking for funding to cover all costs, but if it's one thing that should be a priority, it would be vehicles. Both for replacing vehicles, but also in the areas where perhaps public transport may have disappeared over the last few years, and you do get a community group wanting to do something. The venture becomes real and alive when you have a vehicle. But in assessing that sort of situation, having the vehicle can act as the catalyst to really think through, well, how will we make this work? We can't expect public finance to cover all the costs of this, but the vehicle, having a vehicle really gets things going and gets you thinking about other costs, gets you thinking about realistic fares for the passengers that you're going to be carried. So forces you moves you away from looking at perhaps providing services for free to services that will cost people, but what will be acceptable and how do we work it out? So I think if, in terms of funding, if one thing could be done, I think that a fund for vehicles would be the one thing that would make a difference to the sector.
Thanks for that. The other aspect of the written evidence is the continuity or surety is probably a better word. And I think you raised it yourself also in regard to only knowing what your budget was going to be available for, 1 year. So have you any views whether we should be recommending a 3-year budget or some security? It may not be the amount that you would wish, but at least you know where you stand. Is that something you would maybe?
Yes, I would really vouch for 3-year funding as a minimum. I think it's difficult for local authorities to make any commitment beyond 3 years, but given that this is transport, which is it's something that if you're going to get involved in transport, then you should be looking well ahead, well into the future. It's part of infrastructure. Anything much less than 3 years is just making life difficult for everyone. I can understand why the situation, why we have the situation we currently have over the last 3 years. That some local authorities will say that we're uncertain about our funding from year to year, but it would make a difference to commit to 3-year funding, because you can use that time and commitment to think about, for example, if you're going to use resources to buy vehicles, if you feel you're going to be around for a long time, then you're going to be much more confident about making that investment decision than if your, let's say, core funding could disappear in 6 months or a year's time. So 3-year funding would make a big difference.
Okay, and it's something else that you raised, and it really is very key to what you were saying about having resources available to buy new vehicles. So it might seem that a solution to the problem would be to lease, which would mean you wouldn't have this need for heavy capital expenditure. But if I could say to you, and maybe you would want to comment, that leases, I should put in record, for the public record, I'm involved in the motor industry, or my son is now. He runs my business. And although we are involved in accident damage previously, we did the whole range of supplying into all sets of people involved in the transport industry. But leasing, one of the things about leasing, I'm sure you'll agree, is that built into the cost is the repair cost for the vehicle, the mechanical repair side of it. So it's already, the cost is including maintenance. And one of the attractions for buying is that, first of all, you can shop around. If you buy the vehicle for the best deal in town for different parts that you can buy, or different services. Or it may well be that you may want to do it in-house. And I think I would suggest, and maybe you can confirm it, the reason that people that you're engaged with, they go into the buying aspect, much of the work they'll carry out themselves or get it done at a very good cost because of the kind of venture that it is. Maybe that's something you may want to comment.
Yeah, as I said earlier, leasing is not common, but it's certainly it has been on the agenda for community transport operators over the last 2 or 3 years. And I do know of operators who have gone along the leasing line more recently, and it does solve the problem. And in the absence of funding which can buy vehicles, I think that leasing is a realistic option.
Okay, thanks very much for that.
Elaine?
On the issue about the funding for replacement vehicles, I wondered whether you would want to see a return to the pre-2008 situation where the funding was actually held centrally and you could bid directly into a central funded pot rather than a smaller divided pot which had been rolled up in a local authority settlement.
think everybody in my sector would say that it was better in those days than it is now. It's much more difficult now to run a community transport operation, and I think the growth in community transport in Scotland took place over these years, and I'm sure I'm speaking for everybody who knew about the way things used to be, that was better. Local authorities were always important. I mean, if your local authority wasn't particularly supportive of your proposition to the old funds, then your chances of securing funding were pretty slim.
Thanks.
Can I also just ask, do you know why the cost of training for licences is so high, nearly £1,000?
I couldn't give you chapter and verse on how the elements are made up, but there are fixed costs, for the various elements, such as the theory, the practice, which are fixed, which come to around about £500. But that's before you begin to actually go on to, let's say, a 16-seater vehicle to practice. So there are fixed costs, and anybody looking to secure D1 would have to do some practical training, but it would have to be on a vehicle greater than 3.5 tonnes, and perhaps with up to 16 seats. So you're limited in terms of the number of places that you could go to for that training, and then you sit your test. So it's if you could possibly do it cheaper if you were so good at driving that you could just literally walk into a vehicle and knew exactly what to do instantly. But most people couldn't do that. Most people would require some training, and so it's a combination of whatever it's going to cost for training plus the fixed costs of the various elements required in the tests. But from what I've gathered from people who provide training, the costs are generally of the order of £800 to £1,000 or more. So that gives you, that's a substantial cost for, let's say, a volunteer who wants to get involved.
It represents actual cost of training. It's not something I'm familiar with, but changes in the licence that happened at the same time, for instance, require young drivers to be trained in order to pull a trailer behind a car, and I'm aware that the costs are of a similar order in order to achieve that change in the licence.
Okay, anyone else got any further last questions? No? Okay, Mr. Gordon, Mr. McDonald, thank you very much for that. That was very helpful indeed. And I suspend the session a minute to allow the witnesses to leave the room and come for a break. Do you want to? Okay, folks, if we reconvene, the next item is agenda item 3, public petition. It's to consider the evidence we heard from stakeholders at the meeting on the 20th of March on public petition PE 1236, the Lawrence Kirk Junction. We heard a considerable amount of evidence from a range of stakeholders, and I imagine that everyone has had an opportunity to review the official report from that meeting, as well as further submissions from both Transport Scotland and community representatives. Can I ask members for any views and comments that they might have? Alex?
Yes, thank you, Convener. Having reflected on the evidence that we received on that day, I think the two impressions I got are, firstly, that there is still a significant difference of opinion in relation to the needs among the agencies which were represented. However, at the same time, I believe there's also a process in taking place which has the capacity still to bring the opinions further into line. It's my understanding that a meeting is likely to take place between Nestrans and Transport Scotland to discuss this further, and I would certainly be interested in considering the outcome of that meeting at some time in the future.
Okay, so you should say we're joined by Nigel Don, the local member on this issue. Nigel, do you have anything to say?
Well, thank you, Convener. I'm not sure at one level there's anything to add, but at the risk of repetition, maybe the point should be made that whilst the petition came to the Parliament on a matter of safety, it is on reflection entirely clear to me
after that slight interruption, we can resume. I think, Nigel, you had the floor. Have you forgotten your train of thought? Or?
Well, no, I think the train of thought's still there, and at the risk of the official report backtracking, the point that I was trying to make was that the reason I thought the petition should come to the Infrastructure Committee is simply because the safety issues at that junction are a direct consequence of the lack of infrastructure in the area. And therefore it is really the infrastructure that we need to address. We heard last time that the traffic's already twice the flow rates at which, if you were designing that road from scratch, you would put in a grade separated junction. So I think that just speaks for itself. Given that house building in the area is clearly going to increase, and therefore the number of cars on the road is surely bound to increase. We heard about a likely increase in traffic from Montrose Harbour. We, I think, are aware, convener, perhaps more than some others, of the increase in business in Aberdeen, for reasons which I think are well understood by anybody local there. And I don't think there's any possibility that the completion of the AWPR in a few years' time is going to reduce the traffic going up the A90. So everything that we know about says there's going to be more traffic there. Therefore, the infrastructure is going to become increasingly more inadequate. I'm struggling for terms. So it seems to me to be entirely obvious that this does need to be dealt with, and I therefore just need to encourage the committee to hold on to this petition for the infrastructure reason which gives rise to the safety issues which the petitioner speaks about, and try to see what on earth the committee can do in the months and hopefully only months ahead to get Transport Scotland to understand this needs to be addressed, please.
Before I bring you in, Alex, does anybody else have anything that they want to say? No? Alex.
I was going to back what Nigel has been saying there, and we've received 2 further submissions since we last discussed this. One very emotional one from Jill Fotheringham, the petitioner, but also a very informative one from Mike Robson. And one of the points he makes is that the figures being used by Transport Scotland are actually rather out of date, and they support what Nigel has just said. And the point he makes is that when you look at the proportion of traffic crossing the road to that travelling along the A90, the figure they use would indicate a proportion of 1 in 12 crossing the road, when actual more up-to-date figures indicate that it's a proportion of 1 in 4. So I think this is something that is on the move. Many of these figures are changing, and it must be dealt with in an up-to-date fashion. That's why I'm very interested in taking the opportunity to consider the outcome of current meetings and negotiations between the interested parties.
Well, I think if I was to sum up the view of the committee, it would be that we are pleased that there is a meeting going ahead on, I think, the 24th of April of the local council, Nestrans and Transport Scotland. I think we would like to hear a report of that meeting rather than close the petition. I mean, we're pleased that perhaps we can claim as a result of our meeting and taking this petition forward that has happened. But I think we would want to to hear how that meeting went before deciding what to do further. Would that be the view of the committee? Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much. The next item of business, agenda item 4, subordinate legislation. We have 4 negative instruments on the agenda to be discussed. The first instrument relates to tenant information packs, and the other 3 concern parking regulations. The Subordinate Legislation Committee didn't raise any concerns in relation to any of the instruments. The committee is invited to consider any issues that it wishes to raise in reporting to Parliament on these instruments. Members should note that no motions to annul have been received in relation to any of the instruments. Does anyone have any comments on those instruments? No. Okay, is the committee agreed that it doesn't wish to make any recommendation in relation to these instruments? That's fine, thank you. At this point we move into private, so thank you.